sister in Pennsylvania who had been a Latin teacher, make a footnote of that, and ultimately to her father's childless brother in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. Mother graduated from that high school in 1936, and she entered nursing school at the University of Minnesota. So you see, we were a very small family and would remain so. Now, despite or maybe because of her own abandonment and abuse issues, Mother tried everything to keep us all together. But home life was very tense all the time. She had a wonderful sense of humor. She loved reading. She made certain we had good books, even a set of encyclopedias for me to study, which I perused all the time. Occasionally, Mother would send us to Sunday school, and it was at a Methodist church some 15 blocks away from our house. And the four of us children had to walk that distance just to be there, and then to walk all the way home. It was really brutal in the winters, and it wasn't very convenient even in the summers. So you can see that we probably weren't very regular at attendance at Methodist Sunday school. So I was in a primary class from ages 3 or 4 to age 5 at that Methodist church. Mother said, when I asked her why we went to church and why she didn't, that was a soap in the mouth opportunity for me. But I asked her why we were going there, and she said, because religion is good for children and for old people. So I guess she would tell me now that I'm cramming for my finals. I remember, though, at that church, and I know this sounds pretty far-fetched, but at that church, I remember the first time I experienced God. I must have been about age 4. One Sunday, our class in that Methodist Sunday school had been out in the churchyard playing, doing something. And we were coming into the classroom that was at the end of a very long hall. The walls were white, they were plain, there were no decorations. In those days, after World War II, we didn't have banners and butters and all of that, butterflies and all of that sort of thing to deal with. And as I walked through, I noticed there was on the wall a man standing there who had a beard. He was wearing a red sheet, I thought it was, wrapped around him. He had very long hair. And nothing was said, but he seemed to be coming toward me from the wall. I know I'm probably certifiably insane, but it stunned me, and I stopped and looked there. And the teacher was very annoyed with me. She wanted me to continue on. And I said, well, look at that man, look at that man. He was just kind of beckoning with a hand like this. And she became very angry with me and pushed me along, insisting there was really nothing to see there. Well, not to her, there wasn't. Within a few months, a neighbor girl told us of her Lutheran church that was just 4 blocks from our home, and Mother felt that was a better option. So she sent us there, and we were assigned to a kindergarten class. That's why I remember I was very young. But the other children in the class were much, much smarter than myself. They actually knew stories from the Bible. They recited Bible passages from memory. I remember John 3:16 was the first verse that I ever heard them speak. But happily, the teacher noticed how backward I was and how behind I was from the rest. Mercifully, she took me under her wing and she brought me up to speed with the other kids. Well, by age 7, Georgiana and I were in the junior choir too. See how this church thing kind of grows on you? You start one thing and pretty soon you're doing everything. But we sang regularly at the Sunday worship service at this Lutheran church now that we were attending. The pastor, Reverend Brado, was about the age of my grandfather, who had died when I was 3. He really did look like my grandfather. He would walk around the neighborhood throughout the week. He'd go calling people house to house. Mother didn't like those impromptu visits. She said it always caught her off guard, whatever that meant. But I, of course, adored his visits. Because I was in a house full of girls and without much of a fatherly presence, I craved his grandfatherly countenance. He was a very kind and good man. But if Mother would see Reverend Breda walking on our block, she'd begin going room to room to shut all the windows, pull down the shades, and close the doors, hoping that Reverend Breda would think we were not at home. Well, if she would go to one room and then to another, I would go behind her and open up all the shades, open the doors and the windows, and Reverend Breda, of course, came to the door. He was a wonderful man to talk to. My mother actually liked talking with him once they got going, but he was the only role model I had, male role model I had as a young boy. He asked me once what I might want to be when I grew up. He said, maybe you'd even like to be a minister. Oh, no, I'm going to be a scientist, I said. I'm going to be a doctor. At age 9, I came home from Sunday school one day and announced to my mother that I wanted to be baptized. She was absolutely horrified. She said, Albert, she said, we don't do that kind of thing in our family. I didn't know what on earth she meant by that. She said, if we let you be baptized, we have to have the girls baptized too. So out of the Christian love and charity that was welling up in my heart for my sisters and their good fortune, I said, I don't care what you do with the girls. I'm going to get baptized. I never knew what wrangling went on behind the scenes. That must have meant a lot. But on Easter morning, 1953, my 3 sisters and I were baptized at St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church in North Minneapolis. It was kitty corner from the enormous, foreboding Ascension Catholic Church across the street. We have a member of that community here tonight who I never knew was a member of that parish when I was across the street. The priest at that parish, I think it was a Monsignor Dunphy, is that right? Monsignor Dunphy, happened to be, of all things, a very good friend of my beloved pastor, Paul H. Brado. And I wondered, how on earth can my beloved pastor, whom I so admire, be involved with a Catholic? 40 days later, Ascension. The junior choir was to sing at the evening communion service. Georgian and I were leading the recessional hymn when the service was over, and we were leading the other children out from the front pews, out down through the center aisle, and we were going to be taking off our vestments and going home. The organ was going full blast. It was a big pipe organ in the church. And the church was, well, Lutherans are pretty good singers. We have to admit that, don't we? And they were singing this was in the 1950s, so that was when church was really the thing. And as we're walking down the aisle, I heard a man's voice who kept calling my name. And it was annoying, and I thought, I turned to my sisters, we're walking out now, supposedly singing. And I said, did you hear that guy? She said, I didn't hear anything. Oh, a girl, of course, she wouldn't hear this. So the voice continued, even when we went downstairs to the choir room and were taking off our vestments. And it got to the point that I really got frightened by this. I didn't know what this was all about. I bolted out of the church. I ran home all the way with my sister trailing behind me. I found Mother and told her what had happened. I was really badly shaken by this. And she said to me, she wrapped her arms around me, which was a rarity. Mother wasn't that demonstrative. But she said calmly, it might be God calling you. I said, what on earth would God want to be calling me for? She said, well, maybe we won't know that right now. It may take some years before you find out, but you will find out. Well, several years passed. I was 12. When my two older sisters married two Marine buddies that they had met, Sharon married a guy named Mike, who I felt was really the elder brother I needed but never had. I loved this guy to death. My sister Carol married Bill, who was from New Jersey, who announced right away that he was a proud atheist. And he was an obnoxious atheist, I have to say. He and I never really hit it off, ever. Well, Mike was a devout Baptist, very well versed in the Bible, and one day he challenged me to prove through the Bible that Lutheranism was legitimate. I was like a 15-year-old boy at that point. And by the time I was 16, I read through the entire Bible, marking pages and marking verses that seemed to support my faith and others that seemed to challenge his. Well, the summer of 1956, they were married, and Georgianne and I, with our parents, moved to Brooklyn Park. 3 blocks away from that little house in Brooklyn Park was a Norwegian Lutheran church. Imagine Norwegian. I had never really known many Norwegians before. So Mother felt that we should go to confirmation classes there. We were of the right age, and the two of us joined up. I loved it. The young minister there was freshly out of the Air Force, where he had been a chaplain. He had a wife and family, but he was very supportive, very caring. I think he could see what was wrong in our family. And it was exactly what my sister and I needed at that stage in our lives. So at 14, and finishing confirmation class and about to enter into the 9th grade, the school explained that each student was allowed one elective class the following year, the freshman year. There were 6 choices. Home economics, well, that was for girls. And then there was shop class, that was for boys. I already knew how to hold a hammer and all that, so I didn't think I needed to go. But then there were 4 languages from which you could choose. There was French, which I thought was cool, but it wasn't very practical. German, which sounded to me way too harsh and guttural. Spanish, which, well, frankly, seemed like gobbledygook to me at that time. And then for the very first time, they were adding Latin that year. Assuming that was only for Catholics, Latin was simply anathema. I would not be going there. But enlisting Mother's help, she reminded me that I had wanted once to be a scientist or a doctor. And she said there was a lot of scientific wording and terminology and medical terms in Latin, which she had learned in nursing school, so it would probably be a possibility, at least to keep on the back burner. And then besides, her father's spinster sister in Pennsylvania, Aunt Fanny Rebecca Sholes, had been a Latin teacher. She had even published a Latin book at one time. And when Mother lived with her, she had to take Latin, of course, and she survived. So she said, you know, if you take it, you'd probably survive too. So pondering all of that together, and despite the whole Catholic thing, I chose Latin. I studied for 3 years, loved it, still do, these 65 years later. Every day I do my breviary in Latin. I absolutely love the Latin language. Well, Mother opened up a conversation about what I wanted to do in life in case I didn't do that science thing. Lawyer maybe, or perhaps a teacher, politics even. Latin would be a real help in learning English, vocabulary, and grammar. But she said I had plenty of time to choose, for this was America. One could become whatever one wants in America. She said, oh, but there is only one thing I want you to promise me. And I said, well, what is that? She said, promise me that you will never become a Catholic. I told her that was probably not going to happen anyway. But I really began to wonder why my family was so filled with hatred for Catholicism and the Catholic Church, especially my mother, who was so kind and gentle about everything else. What had the Catholic Church or Catholics ever done to my parents or my family or anybody that made us hate them so? That was the first time I was introduced to prejudice. In the 9th grade, I also became a member of the select choir, and for 4 years I sang all that beautiful music, especially J.S. Bach, my absolute favorite to this day. And it so intrigued me, the music that he wrote and the scriptural passages that he wrote in his music, that gave me goosebumps, that I decided I have to know more about this man. So I got a book from the library and discovered that Bach was a Lutheran. And I learned there, through him, to begin appreciating the biblical, liturgical, the mystical or musical heritage that was part of authentic Lutheranism. Later at the university, I joined the Bach Society, which performed his cantatas and motets like the Magnificat. Many of you probably know that piece. And also his famous B minor Mass, which practically transported me to heaven. After graduation from high school in 1962, my 18th year, I entered the university, and I registered, of course, for as many science courses as I could get, math courses as well, which I didn't like. But by the second quarter of that year, and for something just a little lighter, I took a literature class. And that class began by assigning writings from early Christian authors. I read an account of the martyrdom in 165 of a bishop from Smyrna, a disciple of St. John, named St. Polycarp. At age 85, Polycarp was martyred by being burned alive at the stake. I resolved to explore why Polycarp was so courageous. What made him so brave to face flames like that? Resolving to live as much like him, Polycarp, as I possibly could, I became really a disciple of his. And I finally understood why Catholics are so devoted to the saints. The university then required a year's study in a modern foreign language, which, if you had studied it in high school, you could be validating it by taking an examination, which, if you passed, would exempt you from the language requirement. Ancient languages weren't included, but they did let me take a final exam in Latin, which, only by the grace of God, did I pass. And I was excluded from the requirement. The family finally marveled that my taking a dead language to them had at least been not such a bad idea after all. When I turned 20, May of my sophomore year, 1964, I was still working my way through school, one way by living at home, another by having a part-time job. I washed dishes in a hospital for 5 years. And thirdly, by having a carpool of fellow high school students whom I brought to and from the suburbs to the campus in Minneapolis every day. One beautiful May afternoon, the 6 of us stopped off for some ice cream somewhere. As we were driving home, we passed by a shopping mall that was having a small kind of carnival, and the girls in our group decided that would be fun to go for a couple of rides. But I began to feel, for some reason, not well. I hadn't felt unwell during the whole day, but all of a sudden I just didn't feel well. I had the notion I had to get home as absolutely fast as possible as I could. Finally dropping off the last one of my buddies at his home, about a mile from mine, I experienced a wave of nausea that was so violent that I couldn't even sit up. I had to lie down in the front seat of my car. And my buddy said, I can't stay. I got to get back to my job. I got to go to my job now. So just as he was leaving, I heard an ambulance siren in the background. And I turned to Jerry and I said, that ambulance is going to my house. He said, you're crazy. How could you possibly know that? I said, I don't know, but I know that ambulance is going to my house. Now, my twin sister had stayed home recovering from a bout of pneumonia. Dad had retired early, and he probably just brought Mother home from work from a local factory that she was working at. It had to be one of those three. But as I rounded the last curve about a block from our house, I saw that ambulance actually was in my driveway. Horrified, I also saw at that moment my sister step out of the front door of the house, and she looked in my direction. Then all the neighbors were around, of course, watching. And as I ran as fast as I could, passing through the door, Georgiana said, Mother is dead. I still get emotionally stunned at how those words hit me. But at that very moment, I also heard an agonized groan coming from my mother and dad's bedroom. Mother had finally taken a breath. They finally revived her. In seconds, the ambulance crew had her in the ambulance. With my sister still in her bedclothes and Dad dirty from digging in his garden, they shoved me into the ambulance. And off we went to North Memorial Hospital in Robbinsdale. The driver of the ambulance happened to be one of my high school classmates. As we were careening down the highway, I kept looking back through the window. We had the station wagon type ambulances in those days. You remember those? And I looked back through the window, and the doctors and the nurses were just kind of wagging their heads. And it looked really very bad. I begged God, please, God, please, let her live at least long enough so that I can thank her for the sacrifices that she has made for me. And then I heard words I thought that would never pass my lips. But I said, God, if you make my mother live, I will do anything you ask. Anything. A moment later, everything stopped. The outside scenery looked like it was whizzing by, but we weren't moving. The ambulance wasn't bouncing around. Couldn't hear any sirens or anything. And then came the voice that I'd heard at St. Petri Church 11 years earlier. And it asked me, would you even become a priest for me? Simple question. I was completely stunned. I thought, God would never ask me to do that. That is anathema to me. He couldn't be asking me to do that. I felt like I was going to throw up. And then I heard myself say, please, Lord, I will do anything you ask, except that. I was horrified at what I'd heard myself say, because it was the first time I'd ever in my life that I know of said no to God. A moment later, everything returned to normal. The ambulance rolled into the emergency room, where after doing as much testing as they could in those days, they determined my mother had had a massive cerebral hemorrhage. And the blood vessel that broke was so deep in her brain that surgery was impossible. Her doctor, whom I knew and whom I admired greatly, said, there's nothing further that we can do for her. She was only 47. But she was alive. She was beginning to stabilize a little. And here I thought medicine and science could solve any problem, could perform any miracle. And I was totally disillusioned. Many weeks later, Mother came home, paralyzed totally on her left side. And yet she was able to talk. God had kept his part of the bargain that I had made. I cared for my mother that first year as my three sisters had married and had moved away. I took the opportunities that I did have of thanking my mother many times for the sacrifices that she had made for me. I was really grateful, still am. Ultimately, my mother survived another 27 years, most of them in a nursing home. Later that fall, believing that God had answered my prayer despite my insane refusal to serve as he asked, I felt I should honor the pledge I made with him, so I dropped all my pre-med major classes, took courses that would help me in a seminary kind of setting. I would become a pastor for God. In preparation, I took 2 years of Greek, which I loved, still do, as many biblical, theological, philosophical courses as was possible in a huge state university like the University of Minnesota. And I was always bothered that God had used that funny word, priest. It took me an extra year before finishing at the seminary in 1967. And then at that fall, I matriculated at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. My pastor was delighted. He gave me lots and lots of support. Unfortunately, none of it was financial, because in those days, Protestant seminarians had to pay their own way until they graduated from the seminary. So I had to borrow some. I worked an awful lot to make a go of it. But the Lutheranism that I was learning at the seminary was of a different kind than the principled, high theological viewpoint Lutheranism I studied on my own. Professors were wonderful. I loved them dearly. But it seemed that everything was so watered down, what I now call wobbly, focusing way too much on political matters, on social issues, on justice, civil rights, all that. Remember, it was 1967. And that was, just 3 years after the Dairyland Declaration? Is that about right? And that was 1 year before the Democratic Convention in Chicago. That was such a terrible experience. But everything was changing, and I was becoming a little disillusioned. But 4 weeks after beginning my second year at the seminary in 1968, I was 24 years old, and my father went into the hospital with some serious heart issues. At 49, the year before, he had had an open heart surgery, replacing some valves that were defective or bad or whatever. And I was visiting my grandmother the evening that he telephoned her from the hospital. He and I had had little contact for several years. So I really didn't want to talk to him. But at grandmother's insistence, I did. In that conversation, Dad said to me, the one thing, I never want to go through another heart operation again. That was so horrible. And that was in 1968, of course, when that was just beginning. He said, I never want to go through that again. The very next afternoon, the doctor telephoned me from the hospital, saying Dad had had a massive pulmonary embolus that lodged in the artery between his lungs and his heart. And he needed an immediate surgery to save his life. They needed, of course, permission to operate. And as his closest available relative, they asked me if I could give that permission. I told him about my father's conversation with me the night before, and that he absolutely said he did not want surgery. So I did not let them operate on him. I remember the doctor angrily yelling at me, something like, "You realize you're murdering your own father." Within 4 hours, Dad was gone at 50 years of age. Even funerals then were expensive. Dad had cashed in his insurance policy, and the husbands of my 3 sisters said that they felt no obligation to help pay Dad's funeral and burial expenses. So I pledged to the funeral director that I would pay as best and as fast as I possibly could. So I wouldn't return to the seminary for the rest of that year, working until the debt for my father's funeral was paid. But I began to think, why is everything seeming so hard about this? I had always heard people say that once you say yes to God, everything comes up roses. I'd heard that when you say yes to God, everything falls into place, life is good, it even becomes easy. Well, why wasn't that formula working for me? That next summer of 1969, I knew I needed a change in my life. I arranged with the seminary administration to attend a different Lutheran seminary, but this one was in Chicago, just to have an experience away from my hometown, Minneapolis. So they said that I could take the courses that I had missed, in a sense repeating what I should have taken in my second year. And the only problem, though, was that I was completely flat broke. I knew I could find work, and I did. I took out student loans. Yes, I did. And each month I would sell a pint of plasma or my blood at the University of Chicago hospital across the street from the seminary. That's how I made the car payment every month. And despite the two crazy roommates that the seminary had assigned to me living with me, at least I knew I had a roof over my head. But that housing was in a rundown tenement building near the University of Chicago's south side. There, I was on my own finally, but I was introduced for the very first time in my life to rats and roaches. I wondered, how is God actually in all of this? In those years, the third seminary year at our Lutheran seminaries then was called the intern year. That's when students were assigned to a parish for a year of on-the-job training. That's what we students called it. The seminary from St. Paul notified me that I'd get my assignment in May of 1970. I was 26 years old. But since I'd had some significant personal experiences with death and dying and illness and all other medical emergencies, the faculty felt I should be given an assignment as a hospital chaplain. Funny. It was an emerging ministry back then, and it was a real honor because it just happened to provide the highest possible paying internship available at the seminary. The faculty knew that I was really in need, and I'm grateful that they chose me for it. All they wanted to know was where in the United States or Canada I would prefer to serve. I wrote back to them, I will go anywhere in the entire habitable earth except Minneapolis, Minnesota. They said not to worry because they never sent interns to their hometown anyway. I was not to worry about that. 3 weeks later, I received a letter announcing my appointment at a large hospital in downtown, wait for it, Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was overly disappointed, but to prepare me for that, I first had to complete an initial 12-week chaplaincy training course at a large state mental hospital in Wisconsin. That experience was totally wonderful. I learned a great deal. I was certain chaplaincy was going to be the slot in life I was going to fill. A full year of that kind of thing would be an absolute treat for me. And yet the intake interview that I had with my supervisor in Minneapolis was a bizarre disaster. I mean, it was just bizarre. I was to be one of 8 chaplaincy candidates for that year. The other 7 were all seasoned, ordained Lutheran pastors who had come from parishes all around the country. But despite the very positive final evaluation I'd had from the chaplain supervisor in Wisconsin, this one in Minneapolis insisted that I could not have possibly been that good. I was, after all, just a rookie. He said he really didn't want me for his program. I wouldn't fit very well. But he said to him it was obvious I needed to learn a little humility. And he would graciously administer the lessons to me by giving me, right off the bat, a failing grade in my final evaluation. He crowed that, as a matter of fact, he had had 12 previous seminary students as candidates, and he'd failed every one of the 12 just to teach them a lesson. As diplomatically as I could possibly be, I told him that failing every one of 12 former and now the present 13th seminarian revealed rather more about him than the seminarians. From his office, I drove directly to the pastoral care office at the seminary, where I explained to my supervisor there what had happened. He told me that the chaplain from the hospital had already telephoned him, explaining that he was only joking at the time. He was just kidding about failing me, and he actually did hope that I would go there. So they talked me into taking up the post. Warily, I took it up. The year turned out to be absolutely the most intolerable experience of my life. I endured months of insults from him, asides in classes pointing out my deficiencies or against the others, treatment that these days would be counted as harassment, even sexual harassment. And I finally felt I had to leave. So my adventure in hospital chaplaincy was over. So I had disappointed God again, but this time because I was a failure. Just as a footnote, interestingly, I heard later that 6 of the 7 remaining chaplaincy candidates also left the program early because of the way he treated people. So in 1971, at 27 years of age, I'd lost everything. I lost my job, my internship, my fellowship income, my hopes of ministry, and out on the street. I was really destitute. But to keep alive, and also just to get my head screwed on straight, I returned to Chicago, where my friends that I had made there put me up on their sofas for 6-8 months until I found a job and was able to rent a little apartment. I found a very small, intimate little Lutheran church with a wonderful young pastor who was very deeply involved with the high liturgical tradition of Lutheranism that still remains in the Swedish branch of the church's heritage. His preaching was soundly biblical, which is very important to me, as most of you know. And he was a keen observer of the issues that had been raised at Vatican II. And he provided me a better theological, liturgical, and homiletical education than I'd ever gotten at the 2 seminaries I'd attended. But just to keep my academic juices flowing properly, I went to night school and took German. Then, after a couple of years of paying off my debts and managing also to stay alive, a friend whose seminary career experience was about as choppy as my own phoned to say he'd found a conservative, well-respected Lutheran seminary that was exactly the place where we belonged. I was 28 years old. There was only one problem: a very strict admission policy, saying that we had to have proficiency, proven efficiency in Latin, Greek, German, and Hebrew, of all things. So with the 3 of them already under my belt, I took a remedial Hebrew class. I was not the best student in the class, but I passed, so that we could read the Old Testament in the original. And I was accepted to the seminary, and I transferred all my credits. I studied with some theologically conservative and very world-famous Lutheran theologians, liturgists, Bible scholars, and I loved every minute that I was there. After a year and a half, I graduated and was given a temporary placement in a parish in New York's Long Island, substituting for a very competent pastor there who had suffered a very severe heart attack. The parish was what we called high liturgically. The people were wonderful, but of course they had to be. I was the only replacement the bishop could find. As things turned out, the pastor's recovery did not turn out well. He informed me that he was going to retire on a disability pension, but he had talked to the parish leadership, and he said the congregation wanted me to continue on. Well, there was some considerable wrangling about that, but afterwards the bishop decided to ordain me there on June 20th, 1975, in a Lutheran church body that was different from the one I'd been educated in. I was 31 years old, and I stayed at that parish for 10 years. It was a dream come true. Yet for reasons unknown, I still felt for some reason something wasn't quite right. It's just a little feeling. You've had that kind of thing yourself. Well, in the 5th year of my pastorate in 1980, the bishop's office sent out a flyer from one of the universities in the country that had a summer school program for clergy in Rome. And it was a course on art and architecture. It was covered by a full scholarship for travel, for tuition, and all the fees and whatever. Anyone could apply for it. Just for kicks, I applied. And I've never won anything in my life, but I did win that. One day, as we were going through we were taking a day off from our usual treks around Rome and other churches, I decided that I would go to the Vatican on my own to see St. Peter's Basilica. I'd been elsewhere in Europe a couple times before. I'd noticed, as you probably have if you've gone there, how casually tourists walk through churches and cathedrals, even smoking, laughing, joking, playing around. Seeing all those tourists in St. Peter's Square, I thought, well, you can expect the same kind of thing in the Basilica. But as I approached the main doors of the Basilica, I noted a large wooden sign with hand-painted lettering at the top in several languages, outlining the dress and comportment codes that the staff had to let you pass before you could enter the church. Still, I told myself, don't expect now that you're going to see a flock of cardinals walking about, or choirs singing and clouds of billows of incense floating through the atmosphere, because that just is not going to happen. Don't be disappointed. When I stepped through the second set of doors, there were clouds of incense, a choir was rehearsing, and there were bishops and cardinals everywhere. It was, for me, a sensory overload. I know it was. And as I stood in there taking all of this, I looked down and saw at my feet a large red dot embedded in the concrete, well, not concrete, but the granite floor. A sign which circled around this big red dot. It was all in Latin, and it said, on this spot, on Christmas Day, in the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And I realized that Rome was where I belonged. It just came that quickly to me. I had the strangest feeling, but how could I ever get to that at that point in my life? One evening on a flight back home from visiting my family, I was reading a theology book by a Catholic theologian. I don't remember which it was. On reflection, I realized it was a trend. In fact, I'd been reading many books by Catholic theologians, and they were only by Catholic scholars, and I'd been doing that for some time. I wondered, really, why? Why am I doing that? But I found them really enlightening. By the 10th year of my pastorate, I turned 40. Years before, I'd taken up downhill skiing, and I really enjoyed it. Before Holy Week, I'd gone skiing, and Felt a little fatigue in my lower back for a couple of days. But for years, I'd always taken a few days vacay after Easter to fly back home and visit my mother and grandmother and my sister. But I was so tired, I was so achy, I knew I couldn't even make the trip. I chalked it up to getting old. That evening of Easter Wednesday, I grabbed a good book, poured myself a glass of giggle water, and was fixing to step away from the kitchen counter. And as I turned, I bumped into the dog, who happened to be underfoot. A few drops of wine spilled out onto the kitchen floor, but with napkin in hand, I bent over to wipe up the wine. Standing up again, I herniated 3 discs in my lower back. I remember falling against the wall in such excruciating pain, I was certain I would black out. Somehow I was able to hobble back to my chair. Phoned my sister Georgianne. She'd had her own back injuries a number of times. She said I needed to get to the emergency room right away. I actually was able to drive there and spent the next 6 weeks in traction. It was 1984, so diagnostic tools were not as sophisticated as they are now. And so the doctors could not really immediately see where and how badly the damage had taken place. But it was obvious some serious damage had been done. I ultimately went home, bedridden for weeks more, managing with serious pain medications. My sister flew out from Minneapolis to come and care for me for the first couple of weeks. But to help me pass my time, I knew it was going to be some time of recuperating. I asked her to buy me a small computer in those days, 1985 now, which would enable me to learn about this new technology with computers that people were talking about. I just had to know it. As time passed, it was obvious that since I could barely walk, certainly I could not work, so the bishop put me on medical leave, which meant that in time I had to move out of my beautiful home, a beautiful rectory that I lived in, right next to my parish church. But I wondered, where am I going to go? What is going to happen to me? What if I never heal? What if I never walk again? A few weeks later, some friends came over to pack up my things for me, books and all. But once again, I had lost everything: my home, my income, my job, my so-called career. All of it was over, and at the prime of my life, at 40 years of age. Now on earth, what? Just days later, on a beautiful spring day, I was in my wheelchair praying morning prayer. I came to the part in the Benedictus. Most of you who do the daily office know this. I came to the part called the Benedictus. That's the prayer that John the Baptist's father said after John was born. And I came to those beautiful words: the day spring from on high shall break in upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. I sat there quietly for a moment, closed the book, and I remember looking up for some reason, and I said, Father, why did you do this to me? In a flash, the familiar voice from years earlier answered, because you never listened to me. I answered, when did I not listen to you, Lord? He said, when I asked if you would become a priest for me. But Lord, I did listen to you. I did become a priest. Well, Lutherans don't use that word priest, but it's the same thing. It starts with the letter P. Isn't that good enough? God said, no. I asked if you would become a priest for me. I shrieked out, now? Look at me, Lord. I'm in a wheelchair. I may never walk again. How could I possibly become a priest now? You leave that to me, he answered. But how could I possibly get through seminary all over again? How could I possibly afford it? I don't have a penny to pay for it. You leave all that to me, he said. Well, how would I begin? Where would I go? I said, leave all that to me. I felt cornered. I couldn't walk away, drive away, turn away. Not this time. I had to face it. I thought I was going to faint. I was certain I was going to throw up. And everything got very quiet because every option that I once had failed. And I began to weep profusely. Everything got eerily quiet. And I remember just wrangling in my chair, just writhing. I was just beside myself, all alone in this house. And I finally surrendered, gave in. Between sobs, I said, all right, Lord, I'll do what you ask, but you only can make this happen. Only grant me one thing, Lord. What is that, he asked. I said, promise me that you will never, no matter what happens, you will never abandon me. I don't recall that God gave an answer at that point. A couple of days later, my doctor telephoned saying that he had been at a meeting in Manhattan and met a neurosurgeon at some conference there. And this young surgeon somehow had heard of me. He said he might be able to help if I would let him operate on me. And after a battery of tests, some truly excruciating, he was certain that he could help finally. Within the month, I had the back surgery. And within hours after the Novocaine finally wore off, I did feel some relief. When he came to see me, he asked if I had any questions, as doctors often do after you've had a surgery. And I said, I just have one question. He said, well, what is that? It was the middle of June, but I had to ask anyway. I said, this Thanksgiving, will I be able to go skiing as I usually do? He said to me, there is one condition. And what is that? If there's snow. My Thanksgiving Day of 1985 went as usual that year. My family had always mocked me for being what they called a perpetual student. Maybe those names came to me with the notion that I should return to graduate school. So that's what I decided to do. And having a long-time admiration for the Jesuits, I applied to Fordham University in New York City and was accepted. And they were having me skip the necessary requirements for a master's degree first, another master's degree, and put me directly into the doctoral program in theology. And all that study that I'd done for years, that I'd loved so much, all the good grades that I'd gotten at those seminaries, had finally paid off. But one requirement was proficiency in both German and French. So I finally had to take French, a remedial course in that, being able to read French at least, enough to pass by. I was able to study the Greek and Latin fathers of the church in original languages, which I felt I was in heaven. It was absolutely one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. 14 months after I was received at Fordham University, and at 42 years of age, I was received into the Catholic Church. I was told there was no guarantee that I would be able to become a priest, but I was leaving all of that in God's hands. He'd been doing pretty well so far. The 2 semesters I had taken the previous year at Fordham had left me penniless, but I applied to the theology department at Fordham for fellowship to cover my expenses. The theology department said that they would announce the financial awards the day after Labor Day. And by that time, I had less than $3 in my checking account. The cupboard was empty, and the rent was already overdue. As promised, the chairman of the department phoned and told me the competition was very serious that year. And because there weren't enough fellowships to go around, unfortunately, I was not one to receive the fellowship. He was very gracious, and I thanked him for calling me. And a little stunned by all of this, I was sitting in my chair, and my greyhound Marcus Aurelius was sitting across the room from me on the sofa. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, Mark, it looks as if my adventure in theology has come to an end." A moment later, I said to the dog, "No, I cannot believe that God would bring me this far and through so much only to drop me now." With that, the telephone rang. Really, it was only seconds. And it was the chairman of the theology department telling me that a few moments earlier he had somehow found another fellowship proposal lying on his desk. Only the proposal's particular said that there was a need for someone familiar with and not afraid of working with, wait for it, computers. He said he didn't know of anyone who could possibly do it, but if I was unafraid of computers at that time, the fellowship was mine. I asked how much that fellowship was worth. The chairman answered, $60,000 per year. 60. 45,000 of that would have to go back to the seminary for my tuition and all that kind of thing. The remaining 15,000 could go for my living expenses. And I was such a penny pincher in those days, I could live on that for a year. I won that fellowship for 5 consecutive years, totaling $300,000, which paid for my entire doctoral education. Was there not an unseen hand working there? Well, at age 43 and feeling the need to decide about the priesthood, where I'd go, what I would do, I realized that at my age, I was probably not going to fit in absolutely everywhere. In fact, I had just turned 44. I was worrying that I might be considered too old to enter the priesthood. I returned to New York from visiting my family at home. But by October 1st that same year, my grandmother entered the hospital after her 100th anniversary, 100th birthday, entered the hospital and quietly died. Happily, I was at her side. I returned home to New York, mulling over the possibilities. Where will I find a diocese that would accept me? I'd given up on the idea of joining the Society of Jesus. Not that they weren't kind to me and all, but the novices were all in their early 20s, and I was in my mid-40s by then. It would never work. So I felt adrift, but I finished my work at Fordham, wondering what was to come next. Easter Day of 1990. I phoned my mother to give her my best wishes. I was 46 then. She had just turned 73. She wanted me to be the first to know something that was very important, but it had to be a secret between her and me. Mother never talked like that all my life. She never said such a thing. So I was wondering what in the world is going on with her now. She said, "I have decided to become a Catholic." After my stunned silence, I asked how she had come to that decision. I'd never tried to influence her in any way, never tried to evangelize to her and all this. She said, I want to become Catholic because I have seen how happy my son is since becoming a Catholic. And I want that for myself. I told her to have Georgianne phone me later so we could arrange all this to happen. And when she called, my sister said that she had decided to become a Catholic also. I told her to stop telling me this because I had a weak heart. Of course I was elated, but stunned by the surprise. The next day I phoned the pastor at the parish, just down the block from the nursing home her mother was living. Introduced myself as a frequent visitor to that parish when I was in town, because I would go to daily mass there. Telling him of the situation, I asked if he would go a block or two down to the nursing home to catechize my mother and my sister together and to bring them into the church. He said he would be happy to do it. A couple of months later, on August 15th, the anniversary of my own reception to the Catholic Church, my mother had a very serious heart attack. She was not expected to survive the night. I took the first plane I could out of New York, and later that evening, my sister and I went to see the pastor to inquire about possible funeral arrangements for Mother. He said Mother was a catechumen. She had a right now to be buried from the church. But then he asked me, just exactly who are you? I told him who I was, what I was doing. I was just finishing my doctoral studies at Fordham, and that my ultimate hope was to enter the priesthood as soon as I could find a diocese willing to accept me. And he simply looked at me and said, well, why not study for us in St. Cloud? I was taken aback. I'd never even thought of that possibility. Well, as it turned out, Mother had a remarkable recovery. I returned to New York, continued to phone her often to see how she was coming along. She told me the priest from Elk River was constantly asking her about me and wanted me to go see the bishop. He wants to see the bishop as a possibility of coming to St. Cloud. I was just unsure of this whole thing. He couldn't have really meant that. So I told her I would be coming home at Christmas time, and I would go with that priest to see Bishop Hannes in those days. But as we were driving up to St. Cloud from Elk River, I told him Mother was failing fast, so I thought that we should make provision for her to be received into the church soon. He agreed and said he would receive them at the midnight mass on Christmas Eve. At the chancery, I spent 5 hours with Bishop Hannes. He had studied the transcripts from every one of the educational institutions I had attended, along with the mandatory handwritten, no less than 20-page autobiography that you had to submit to the bishop as well. And the day after Christmas in 1990, the bishop phoned me and said he wanted me to come to this diocese, preferably within the week and a half before St. John's Seminary was resuming classes. He wanted me to spend a year in residence there before ordaining me into the priesthood, which I thought was a very fair thing to do. But I said I couldn't really leave that work in New York that quickly, but I would come the next fall, which eventually I did. As it turned out, Mother and my sister were received into the Catholic Church on Christmas in 1990. I was their sponsor. Someone who was taking photographs of the Christmas decorations in the pew a couple ahead of us turned around and snapped a photograph of my mother the moment that the priest placed the host on her tongue for the very first time. And afterwards mailed that photograph without any name or address. We couldn't thank her, but I remember seeing her, but she took that photo for us. And I pondered the possibility of studying for this diocese. And on the first Sunday in Lent, 1991, Just 9 weeks after she was received into the Catholic Church, my mother died peacefully in her sleep at the nursing home. That summer, I arrived from New York to my new home in St. Cloud, Minnesota, where I was received ultimately into this diocese as a priest 18 months later. And 32 years after that, I'm still here.